The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet neighborhood, spilling golden light over the neatly lined houses. Everything seemed calm and peaceful. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and a light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. The protagonists stepped out onto their driveway, stretching and taking a deep breath. It was Saturday, a day they usually reserved for tending to their yard and maintaining the property they had worked so hard to care for. In the center of the driveway stood the tractor, gleaming under the morning sun. It wasn't just a machine. It was a trusted companion that made yard work easier and more efficient. Every weekend, the protagonist took pride in mowing the lawn, trimming the edges, and keeping the flower beds neat. It was not only about appearance, but about the satisfaction of seeing a home cared for with love and dedication. The protagonist had lived in this neighborhood for several years. The streets were quiet, lined with well-kept houses, and the neighbors mostly kept to themselves. It was a pleasant place to live, except for one ongoing tension. The HOA, the Homeowners Association, had strict rules about everything. From the color of shutters to the types of plants in the yard, most residents complied quietly, but the protagonist had occasionally clashed with them over minor issues. It wasn't anything serious, just the occasional disagreement about what was allowed and what was not. For a while, things had been peaceful. The protagonist had learned to stay cautious, keeping detailed records of any correspondence with the HOA. Despite this, one member had always seemed to take a special interest in monitoring the protagonist's property. She was known in the neighborhood for her strict adherence to rules and her quick temper. Neighbors often joked about her, but they also quietly avoided crossing her. The protagonist had encountered her before during small disputes, but nothing had escalated beyond words. It was more of an annoyance than a real problem, something to be tolerated while trying to maintain peace. This particular Saturday began like any other. The protagonist was dressed in work clothes, ready to spend the morning on the lawn. The tractor purred to life as it rolled over the grass, leaving neat, clean lines in its wake. The sound was comforting, almost meditative. Hours passed as the protagonist worked, enjoying the quiet rhythm of mowing, trimming, and caring for the garden. Every now and then, a neighbor waved from across the street, and the protagonist waved back, appreciating the small sense of community, while the protagonist worked. Karen, who the neighbors privately referred to as HOA Karen, was already observing from her window across the street. She had a sharp eye for anything that might be considered out of compliance, and she took it upon herself to enforce the rules personally when she saw fit. For now, she was watching silently, her expression unreadable. The protagonist had no idea she was planning to intervene. Assuming it was just another quiet Saturday in a neighborhood that usually stayed out of the way, by midday, the protagonist had finished mowing the lawn and was moving on to trimming the flower beds. The sun was higher now, and the warmth made the work feel pleasant rather than exhausting. They paused to wipe sweat from their brow and admired the neatly kept yard. Everything looked just as it should, orderly and beautiful. There was a sense of pride in the small victories, the perfectly trimmed grass, the colorful flowers, the freshly edged paths. It was a personal achievement, a demonstration of care and hard work. As the protagonist cleaned up the equipment and prepared to move the tractor back into the garage, a sudden noise caught their attention. It was faint at first, a rustling sound from the street, but it grew louder. Turning, the protagonist saw Karen striding down the sidewalk toward the driveway. Her steps were purposeful, and there was an unmistakable intensity in her expression. She was holding a clipboard, and it was clear she intended to confront the protagonist. The calm morning had shifted subtly, undercurrent of tension beginning to ripple through the air. The protagonist stepped aside, giving Karen space, but braced themselves for the inevitable confrontation. Karen stopped at the edge of the driveway, looking at the tractor and the neatly maintained yard. Her eyes narrowed, and she tapped the clipboard with her finger, as if emphasizing the seriousness of her intentions. There was a sense of authority in her stance, the kind that made it clear she believed she was fully justified in what she was about to say. She started speaking, her voice sharp and precise. She pointed out a minor detail on the property that she claimed was a violation of the HOA rules. The protagonist listened calmly, trying not to react emotionally. They had heard these complaints before and knew how to handle them. They offered a polite explanation, noting that everything had been done carefully and within reason. Karen, however, was not satisfied. Her expression hardened, and her tone grew more insistent. She seemed to feel that words alone would not suffice to make her point. The protagonist tried to remain calm, knowing that escalating the situation would not help. They had dealt with HOA disputes before and understood the importance of documenting everything. Still, there was an uncomfortable tension in the air, a feeling that this encounter might be different from the previous minor confrontations. The peaceful Saturday was beginning to unravel, and the protagonist could sense that the morning's tranquility was about to end as the conversation continued. Karen's behavior became increasingly unreasonable. She began pointing at the tractor, making claims that it was in violation of rules that didn't seem to exist. The protagonist's patience was tested, but they maintained composure. They knew that losing their temper would only worsen the situation. Neighbors watching from a distance could sense the rising tension, some murmuring to each other. Unsure whether to intervene, the protagonist suggested that they could discuss the matter further with the HOA office to clarify any misunderstandings. Karen, however, seemed uninterested in dialogue. Her focus was on asserting control, on demonstrating her authority over the situation. The protagonist realized that this was no longer a simple disagreement. It had the potential to escalate into something more serious if not handled carefully. As Karen continued to argue, the protagonist's mind raced through the options. They could try to reason further, risk further confrontation, or step back and document the situation carefully. Choosing the latter, they took out their phone and began recording the interaction discreetly. This was not about provocation, but about protection evidence in case things went beyond words. Karen noticed the phone and shot a sharp look, but the protagonist held steady, refusing to be intimidated. The tension reached a point where it felt like the calm morning had been completely shattered. Karen's insistence and the protagonist's measured responses created a standoff, the air thick with unresolved conflict. The once peaceful neighborhood street seemed charged with an invisible energy. Neighbors watching silently from behind curtains or across the street, the protagonist's heart beat faster, but they reminded themselves to stay composed. This was their home, their property, and they would handle the situation with care. After several minutes of this tense exchange, Karen's voice grew louder and more aggressive. The protagonist noticed a shift in her demeanor, a sense that she was no longer content to argue verbally. Something had changed in her approach, and the protagonist felt a sinking feeling in the pit of their stomach. They realized that this confrontation might soon move beyond words, and that they needed to be ready for whatever came next. The morning that had begun with calm, gentle sunlight, and the comforting hum of the tractor now carried a shadow of uncertainty. The protagonist stood firm, determined not to let intimidation take control of their day. They knew that documenting the situation, keeping composure, and being ready to involve authorities if necessary were crucial steps. The tension lingered, quiet promise that the events of this day would not soon be forgotten. As the protagonist watched Karen, a mix of determination and concern filled their mind. This was not just a minor dispute anymore. It was a challenge to their rights and their sense of safety on their own property. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test patience, courage, and resolve. The peaceful morning had been interrupted, but the protagonist was ready to face what came next, with a steady hand and a clear mind, prepared to protect their home and their tractor from any harm. The tension in the driveway was thick, almost like a heavy fog pressing down on the protagonist. Karen, standing firmly with her clipboard in hand, took a step closer, her voice sharp and insistent. She began listing rules and supposed violations, pointing fingers at details that seemed insignificant. The protagonist listened, trying to stay calm, but there was a growing sense that Karen was no longer satisfied with just arguing verbally. Her eyes darted to the tractor again, and for a moment, the protagonist felt a chill run down their spine. Neighbors had started to notice the escalating confrontation. A few peeked out of their windows, whispering among themselves. Some crossed the street to get a better look, curious but cautious. It was unusual for Karen to show such aggression in broad daylight, and the sudden attention only seemed to fuel her determination. She was a woman used to enforcing rules, but now she seemed driven by a personal sense of power rather than any official authority. The protagonist, though surprised by the intensity, did not move toward the tractor. They knew that any sudden action could escalate the situation further. Instead, they kept their hands visible, speaking in calm, measured tones. "We can go over the rules together and clarify any misunderstandings," they said, hoping to de-escalate the confrontation. Karen, however, did not appear interested in reason or compromise. Her eyes blazed with a mix of anger and determination, and she seemed to ignore the words completely, focusing instead on making her presence felt. Then, without warning, Karen stepped closer to the tractor. The protagonist's heart raced, and a sense of alarm surged through them. This was no longer just a verbal confrontation. Something about her movements suggested that she was prepared to take matters into her own hands. The neighbors watching held their breath, sensing that the situation could turn physical at any moment. The protagonist quickly realized that they had to act carefully, thinking not only of protecting their property, but also their personal safety. Karen's hands moved to the tractor, and the protagonist instinctively stepped forward to stop her. "Wait, stop," they shouted, their voice a mix of fear and authority. But Karen ignored the warning, her focus entirely on the tractor. She grabbed a tool from her bag and struck at the tractor with a force that seemed intentional. Metal clanged loudly as the impact echoed across the quiet neighborhood, breaking the calm that had existed just minutes before. The protagonist gasped, their mind racing with disbelief. This was not just a petty dispute anymore. This was deliberate damage to their property. The neighbors gasped as well. Some shouted from a distance, trying to get Karen's attention, but she was relentless. She swung again, and another sharp metallic sound rang out. The protagonist, heart pounding, moved closer to shield the tractor, shouting for her to stop. The confrontation had escalated to a point where words alone could no longer control the situation. Fear and frustration mingled in the protagonist's mind. But there was also a growing determination to protect what was theirs. Karen's face was set in a scowl, her lips tight and her eyes flashing. She seemed convinced that she was enforcing some sort of justice. Though it was clear to everyone watching that her actions were extreme, the protagonists carefully kept their distance, but used their voice to maintain authority. "Stop this now. You are damaging my property," they yelled, hoping to make it clear to both Karen and the neighbors that her actions were unacceptable. Karen paused for a moment, perhaps realizing that others were watching, but only briefly. She seemed driven by her own sense of righteousness, convinced that she was above reproach. The protagonist could see the strain of frustration in her eyes, but also a dangerous level of determination. The tractor, once a symbol of pride and calm, now stood at the center of a tense standoff. Every swing and strike added a new layer of stress and fear. Making it clear that this confrontation could not be ignored or handled casually, the protagonist decided it was time to involve witnesses more formally. They began speaking loudly to the neighbors, explaining what was happening, and urging anyone with a phone to record the events. This was not about creating drama. It was about accountability. As cameras began to point toward the driveway, Karen's actions were fully documented. The protagonist remained calm, their voice steady, even as adrenaline surged through their veins. Every second mattered, and clear evidence could make the difference if the situation escalated further. Karen, noticing the recording, seemed momentarily frustrated. Her movements became erratic, swinging the tool again, but now with less control. The protagonist saw the opening and quickly moved to protect the tractor without confronting her directly. They used their body to shield the machine, speaking firmly and clearly. "This is enough. Stop now." Their voice carried a mixture of authority and warning, signaling that further aggression would not be tolerated. For a brief moment, it seemed that Karen might stop, her eyes scanning the crowd and the recordings. The tension was palpable, neighbors holding their breath and whispering in disbelief. But instead of backing down, she muttered something under her breath and swung the tool one more time, striking the tractor just enough to dent it. The protagonist's heart sank at the sight, but they maintained their composure. Knowing that any rash action could escalate things further, realizing that the situation was beyond their ability to resolve alone, the protagonist decided to take the next step. They stepped back, carefully keeping Karen in view, and reached for their phone to call the authorities. Their hands shook slightly, but their voice remained steady as they spoke to the police, explaining the situation and requesting immediate assistance. The neighbors continued to watch, some nodding in support, others simply stunned by the turn of events. Karen, noticing that the authorities had been called, seemed momentarily surprised. Her face flushed with anger, and she looked around at the gathering crowd. It was clear that she had not anticipated outside intervention so quickly. The protagonist, though anxious, felt a growing sense of relief, knowing that help was on the way. The police would bring authority and legal enforcement that neither Karen or the protagonist could replace in the heat of the moment, while waiting for the police to arrive. The protagonist continued to speak calmly but firmly, keeping Karen's attention focused and preventing further damage. They moved carefully to ensure that the tractor remained protected, while also trying to prevent any potential escalation. The neighbors remained a silent but supportive presence, some offering verbal encouragement from a safe distance. The minutes felt long, stretching out as every second held the weight of potential danger and resolution. As the first sirens sounded in the distance, Karen finally seemed to hesitate. The sudden presence of law enforcement was a reminder that her actions could have serious consequences. The protagonist watched closely, ready to explain everything to the authorities, knowing that detailed documentation and witnesses would be key in resolving the situation fairly. The tension in the air began to shift slightly, from immediate danger to anticipation of formal resolution. When the police arrived, they quickly assessed the situation. Officers spoke with the protagonist first, taking statements and examining the tractor for damage. Karen, confronted by the authority figures, initially tried to argue and explain her side, but the evidence and witness accounts were clear. The police remained professional, carefully documenting everything and ensuring that both parties were heard. The protagonist felt a cautious sense of relief, knowing that the situation was moving toward accountability and justice. Karen's demeanor shifted as she realized that her actions could not be justified. She tried to maintain a sense of authority, but it was clear that the impact of her behavior had been recognized by both the officers and the neighbors. The protagonist, meanwhile, remained composed, answering questions honestly and providing all the documentation they had gathered. It was a difficult and emotional experience, but standing firm and relying on careful preparation had helped maintain control as the police continued their investigation. The neighbors slowly returned to their homes, some whispering about what had happened, others expressing relief that things had not become more dangerous. The protagonist, still standing by the damaged tractor, felt a mixture of emotions, relief, frustration, and a quiet sense of triumph for having protected their property and handled the confrontation with composure. The situation was far from over, but the immediate threat had been managed, and the groundwork for accountability had been laid by the time the officers completed their initial assessment and left to file reports. Karen had stepped back, muttering angrily under her breath. The protagonist surveyed the damage, noting the dents and scratches on the tractor, and felt a wave of determination. This was not just about property. It was about standing up for oneself and ensuring that no one could act with impunity. The morning that had started peacefully had turned into a test of patience, courage, and resilience. But the protagonist had navigated it with care and foresight. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, the protagonist knew that there would be consequences and follow-up actions. The incident had been intense, dramatic, and frightening, but it had also highlighted the importance of remaining calm under pressure and taking deliberate steps to protect what mattered most. The confrontation with Karen had escalated quickly, but by staying composed and using the tools at their disposal, documentation, witnesses, and authorities, the protagonist had managed to prevent further damage and set the stage for resolution after the police had left to file their report. The protagonist took a deep breath and stepped back to assess the situation. The tractor, their loyal companion for years, had several dents and scratches from Karen's attack. It hurt to see it damaged, but the protagonist knew that the physical repair could come later. Right now, the priority was making sure that the incident was properly documented and that accountability would follow. The protagonist began by carefully photographing every mark on the tractor, from the bent metal edges to the scratches along its body. Each picture was taken from multiple angles, capturing the damage in detail. They made notes alongside the photos, describing exactly what had happened and the sequence of events as they had unfolded. This would be critical for any legal or HOA proceedings. Every small detail mattered: the time of day, the tools Karen had used, and even the way neighbors had witnessed the attack. Once the photos were taken, the protagonist went around the neighborhood to speak with neighbors who had seen the incident. Some had watched from their windows, while others had been on the street. Each witness provided statements, agreeing to be available if the authorities or the HOA needed to verify the events. These statements added weight to the protagonist's case and gave a clear picture that Karen's actions had been intentional and aggressive. The protagonist thanked each neighbor, knowing that their support was crucial and that their willingness to speak up was a brave act. After documenting everything, the protagonist decided it was time to contact the HOA formally. They wanted to ensure that the HOA leadership understood the severity of the incident and that Karen's behavior was not acceptable under any circumstances. Picking up the phone, the protagonist calmly explained the situation to the HOA office, detailing the attack and providing evidence of the damage. They requested an official investigation and any necessary disciplinary action. The office responded politely but cautiously, stating that they would need to review the documentation before taking any action. The protagonist understood that bureaucracy could be slow, but they felt confident that the evidence they had gathered would make the truth clear. Despite taking these steps, the protagonist could not ignore the emotional impact of the incident. Anger, frustration, and disbelief swirled together. How could someone act with such aggression in broad daylight, destroying someone else's property over a petty disagreement? The protagonist reminded themselves to stay calm and focused. Reacting with anger would not help. Measured action was the path forward. They spent some time writing down their thoughts, both to release stress and to have a clear record of their personal experience. It helped them process what had happened without letting emotions cloud judgment. The next day, the protagonist visited a local repair shop to get an estimate for fixing the tractor. The mechanic inspected the damage carefully, noting that while some parts would need replacement, the tractor could be restored to full working order. The protagonist felt a small sense of relief, knowing that the damage was repairable. Still, they were determined that Karen would be held responsible for the cost. This was not about revenge, but about ensuring fairness and protecting the principle that no one should be able to damage someone else's property without consequence. While dealing with the practical side, the protagonist also prepared to speak with law enforcement again. They revisited the police report, ensuring that all the details were correct and that no important element had been overlooked. They included the neighbor statements and photos, creating a comprehensive package of evidence. The protagonist knew that thorough preparation would make a strong case and leave little room for denial or argument. Every photo, every statement, every note was a piece of the puzzle that would eventually show the full truth as the day went on. The protagonist received calls from several neighbors expressing support. Some shared their own experiences with Karen's overzealous behavior, revealing a pattern of intimidation and petty enforcement. The protagonist listened carefully, recording these accounts for potential use in the case. While it was upsetting to hear how many others had been affected, it also strengthened the sense that standing up was important. Not just for themselves, but for the neighborhood as a whole. The protagonist also reached out to an attorney for advice. They wanted to understand their legal rights and the options available. The attorney explained that intentional property damage could carry consequences beyond just the cost of repairs, including fines or even criminal charges. The protagonist felt reassured knowing that there was a legal framework to support their case. They discussed strategy, emphasizing the importance of keeping records, remaining calm, and letting the evidence speak for itself. While all of this was happening, Karen remained a presence in the neighborhood, though more subdued. She had been warned by the police to avoid further confrontation. but the protagonist noticed her watching from across the street from time to time. It was unsettling, but the protagonist refused to be intimidated. They focused on their daily routines, maintaining their property, and continuing with life as normally as possible. Standing firm and not allowing fear to dominate was a critical part of their response. Over the next few days, the protagonist organized all of the documentation into a clear chronological record. Every photo, statement, and note was filed carefully, creating a complete account of the incident. This level of organization would be vital in any discussions with the HOA or legal authorities. It was also empowering, giving the protagonist a sense of control in a situation where others had tried to assert dominance through aggression as they worked. The protagonist also thought about how to handle future interactions with Karen. They planned to maintain a respectful but firm distance, communicating only when necessary through written messages or formal channels. This approach would reduce the risk of another confrontation and protect both parties from unnecessary escalation. The protagonist understood that while it was important to assert their rights, it was equally important to manage potential conflicts in a safe and thoughtful manner. The community began to notice the protagonist's methodical response. Some neighbors admired the calm and careful approach, realizing that it demonstrated strength without aggression. Others expressed relief that the situation was being addressed responsibly rather than spiraling out of control. The protagonist's actions served as an example that standing up for oneself could be done with dignity and respect, even in the face of intimidation. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued working on the tractor, performing minor maintenance and ensuring it remained operational. They treated the machine with care, knowing it was a symbol of their hard work and resilience. Each task completed reinforced the sense that they were not defeated by the attack, but were taking proactive steps to recover and protect what was theirs. The process was therapeutic, helping the protagonist regain a sense of normalcy and control as the week progressed. The HOA finally contacted the protagonist to request a formal submission of all evidence. The protagonist provided everything in detail, including photos, neighbor statements, and the timeline of events. They also included the mechanic's report and the attorney's recommendations. The HOA acknowledged receipt and promised to review the materials carefully, emphasizing that deliberate damage to property would not be tolerated. The protagonist felt a cautious sense of relief, knowing that formal acknowledgement was a critical step toward resolution. Throughout this process, the protagonist reflected on the experience. They realized how quickly a peaceful situation could escalate and how important it was to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. The combination of calm documentation, clear communication, and reliance on authority had allowed them to navigate a dangerous situation without putting themselves at greater risk. It was a valuable lesson in resilience and self-protection, one that they would carry forward in both personal and community interactions. By the end of the week, the protagonist had established a routine, documenting any new developments, keeping the tractor safe, and maintaining regular communication with the HOA and attorney. Karen's presence, while still noted, was less intimidating, and the neighborhood began to return to a sense of normalcy. The protagonist felt empowered, knowing that their careful, deliberate actions had set the stage for accountability and justice. Though the damage to the tractor was frustrating, the protagonist took pride in having handled the situation responsibly. The steps they had taken, gathering evidence, involving neighbors, consulting legal advice, and maintaining composure ensured that Karen could not simply act without consequence. The protagonist's approach demonstrated that calm, prepared action could turn a threatening and aggressive encounter into a path toward resolution and fairness. The following week, the protagonist received a formal notice from the HOA requesting a meeting to review the evidence submitted. They prepared carefully, organizing all documents, photos, witness statements, and repair estimates, ready to present a clear account of the incident. The meeting was scheduled for late morning at a small HOA office not far from the neighborhood. The protagonist arrived early, hoping to stay composed and ensure that the discussion would remain focused on facts rather than personal arguments. As the meeting began, The HOA board members listened attentively. The protagonist calmly laid out the sequence of events, showing photos of the tractor damage, explaining the neighbors' statements, and detailing their interactions with Karen. Each piece of evidence was presented clearly and logically. The board members nodded as they reviewed the material, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The protagonist responded precisely, careful not to let emotion interfere, though they could feel a mix of frustration and relief coursing through them. Karen arrived at the meeting shortly after the protagonist, her expression a mixture of annoyance and determination. She tried to speak immediately, insisting that the situation had been blown out of proportion. The HOA chair gently reminded her to wait her turn and to speak only when requested. Karen's attempts to dominate the conversation were largely ignored, as the board focused on the documentation and facts presented by the protagonist. The contrast between the protagonist's calm professionalism and Karen's frustration became increasingly apparent. The board reviewed the photos in detail, noting the dents, scratches, and visible marks on the tractor. They compared these images with the timeline and witness statements. The evidence was thorough, leaving little room for doubt about the intentional nature of Karen's actions. The protagonist remained calm, but internally felt a sense of vindication. All the careful documentation, witness coordination, and legal preparation had created an undeniable case. Karen's attempts to dismiss the events as trivial were clearly ineffective against such comprehensive evidence. One of the HOA board members spoke first. Acknowledging the seriousness of the incident, they highlighted that intentional damage to property was not acceptable under any circumstances and emphasized the HOA's responsibility to maintain order and fairness in the neighborhood. The tone was firm but professional, making it clear that rules applied equally to everyone. Karen shifted in her seat, muttering under her breath, but the board continued without interruption. Giving their assessment based solely on facts, the board then addressed Karen directly, asking her to explain her actions. Karen tried to argue that she was enforcing rules and that the damage was an accident, but the board members were unimpressed. They asked for specific explanations for the dents and scratches shown in the photos. Karen struggled to respond convincingly, her excuses becoming inconsistent and less credible as the discussion continued. The weight of the evidence and the clear accounts from multiple neighbors left her with little room to defend herself. After carefully considering both sides, the HOA board delivered their decision. Karen was found responsible for deliberate property damage, and several consequences were imposed. She was required to pay for the full repair costs of the tractor, including labor and replacement parts. Additionally, she was fined for violating HOA rules regarding neighbor conduct and the proper handling of disputes. The board emphasized that aggressive behavior toward neighbors would not be tolerated in the future. Karen's reaction was a mix of anger and disbelief, but the HOA maintained its firm stance, demonstrating that evidence and proper process determine outcomes rather than personal influence or intimidation. The protagonist felt a surge of relief. The process had been stressful and emotionally taxing, but justice was being served. They thanked the board for their careful attention and fair handling of the situation. While the damage to the tractor could be repaired, the larger victory was the recognition that aggressive and unjust behavior would not be ignored. The protagonist left the meeting feeling empowered, knowing that standing up for oneself, documenting events carefully, and involving authorities when necessary could lead to meaningful consequences. In the days following the HOA decision, the protagonist received confirmation from the repair shop that arrangements had been made for Karen to cover the cost of repairs. The tractor was soon taken in for service, and the mechanic began the process of restoring it to full working order. Watching the damaged parts being replaced, the protagonist felt a renewed sense of pride and relief. The process was a tangible reminder that deliberate actions had consequences, and that fairness could be restored through patience, preparation, and persistence. The neighborhood began to respond to the outcome as well. Neighbors who had witnessed the incident expressed admiration for the protagonist's calm and methodical approach. Some admitted they had feared standing up to Karen themselves and appreciated seeing that careful action and documentation could lead to accountability. Others noted that the neighborhood felt safer and more fair now. as the precedent had been set that aggressive or unreasonable behavior would not be overlooked. The protagonist felt gratified that their experience had a broader impact beyond their own property. Karen's presence in the neighborhood remained, but her influence and confidence seemed diminished. She was more cautious in her interactions and less likely to confront neighbors directly. The protagonist observed this change, but remained vigilant, maintaining clear boundaries and documenting any interactions in case further issues arose. The experience had reinforced the importance of remaining aware and prepared, even after the immediate threat had been resolved, as the tractor was repaired and restored. The protagonist spent time tending to the yard and resuming normal weekend routines. The sense of pride in maintaining their property returned, untainted by the previous conflict. Each task, from mowing to trimming to planting flowers, became a reminder of resilience and the ability to overcome challenges through careful, thoughtful action. The protagonist felt a renewed connection to their home. Knowing that their efforts and patience had safeguarded both property and principal, the protagonist also reflected on the lessons learned from the incident. Standing up for oneself did not require confrontation or anger. It required preparation, documentation, and calm communication. Legal and HOA processes could be leveraged effectively when approached methodically. The support of neighbors and the careful recording of evidence were critical components in resolving disputes fairly. These lessons were valuable not only for the current situation, but for any future challenges that might arise within the community. Over time, the neighborhood began to feel the impact of the incident beyond just the protagonist's case. Other residents, previously wary of challenging aggressive behavior, felt more empowered to address concerns calmly and formally. Conversations about HOA rules and neighborhood conduct became more open and constructive. The protagonist observed these changes with satisfaction. Recognizing that their experience had helped set a positive example, the incident, while stressful, ultimately contributed to a stronger, more respectful community. Karen, though still present, avoided further aggressive interactions. The HOA continued to monitor the situation, and the protagonist maintained a careful record of any encounters. This ongoing vigilance ensured that the boundaries established by the HOA decision were respected. The protagonist felt secure in knowing that standing up for oneself, with careful planning and evidence, could result in meaningful and lasting protection. As the days turned into weeks, the protagonist continued to enjoy their home and property. The tractor, now fully repaired, became a symbol not only of hard work, but also of resilience and justice. Each time it rumbled to life, it reminded the protagonist of the careful actions taken to preserve fairness and safety. The neighborhood, having witnessed the resolution, gained a sense of balance and reassurance that rules and accountability mattered. The protagonist reflected on the experience as a test of patience, courage, and careful planning. It had been stressful and emotional, but by relying on clear documentation, community support, and formal processes, they had achieved a fair outcome. The incident served as a reminder that even in the face of aggression, calm, methodical action could protect rights and restore order. The neighborhood, once tense with fear of confrontation, began to feel safer. The protagonist felt proud of having contributed to that positive change. With the HOA's decision finalized, and Karen held accountable, the protagonist finally felt a sense of relief settle over their home. The tension that had lingered in the neighborhood for weeks began to ease. Mornings were no longer punctuated by the anxiety of unexpected confrontations or the fear of seeing Karen approach. Instead, the protagonist could focus on their property and the routines they loved, enjoying the calm and satisfaction that came from maintaining their home. The first step was getting the tractor back in perfect working order. The repair shop had worked diligently, replacing dented parts, smoothing out scratches, ensuring the engine ran smoothly. When the protagonist went to pick it up, they ran their hands along the freshly repaired surface, feeling a mix of pride and relief. The tractor was more than just a machine. It represented resilience, determination, and the ability to overcome conflict without compromising one's values. Driving it back home, the protagonist felt a sense of restored control. Knowing that their property had been defended and justice had been served, Once home, the protagonist began using the tractor for regular yard work again. Each pass over the grass, each trim of the edges, was a reaffirmation of normalcy and independence. It was a quiet, almost meditative process, reminding them that life could return to a peaceful rhythm even after stressful incidents. The lawn and garden, carefully maintained, became a symbol of perseverance, and every neighbor who walked by could see the care and dedication that had gone into restoring both property and peace. The neighborhood slowly adjusted to the new balance established by the HOA's ruling. Karen, now aware that her actions had consequences, became noticeably more reserved. She no longer patrolled the streets with a sense of authority, and her interactions with neighbors were cautious and polite rather than confrontational. The protagonist observed this change with a sense of quiet satisfaction. It was not about gloating or revenge. It was about recognizing that fair processes and accountability could restore respect and order. The neighborhood felt safer and more predictable, and other residents previously hesitant began to approach HOA rules and potential conflicts with more confidence. Over time, the protagonist reflected on the lessons learned from the entire ordeal. They realized that facing aggression or intimidation did not require matching anger with anger. Calmness, careful documentation, and involving the right authorities could transform a threatening situation into a controlled, fair outcome. Every photo, witness, statement, and note had contributed to this resolution. The experience reinforced the value of patience, foresight, and reliance on proper channels when addressing disputes. The protagonist felt more prepared for any future challenges. Knowing that measured action and clear evidence were powerful tools, as the days passed, the protagonist continued to maintain their property, now with renewed confidence. They started small projects in the garden, planting flowers and vegetables, and repairing any minor wear around the yard. The process was not just about aesthetics, but about reclaiming a sense of joy and peace after the disruption. Each completed task was a small victory, a reminder that the conflict with Karen, though stressful, had not diminished their ability to enjoy their home and property. The neighbors, too, began to notice a shift in the community atmosphere. The incident with Karen had set a precedent that rules and accountability mattered, that bullying behavior would not be ignored. Conversations among neighbors became more constructive, focusing on positive community engagement rather than fear or resentment. The protagonist's experience served as an example, showing that challenges could be handled effectively without resorting to aggression or passive tolerance. In the weeks that followed, the protagonist also engaged more with the HOA, offering suggestions for clearer communication and better enforcement of rules that prevented future misunderstandings. They attended meetings, providing input from the perspective of someone who had experienced a challenging situation. Their contributions were well received, and the HOA began to consider ways to ensure that enforcement was fair, consistent, and transparent. The protagonist felt proud that their experience had contributed to a stronger, more informed community. Despite the stress of the past few weeks, the protagonist found moments of satisfaction in small victories. A perfectly mowed lawn, a repaired tractor, friendly conversations with neighbors. All of these were reminders that patience, preparation, and calm action could lead to positive results. The experience had tested their resolve, but it had also reinforced values like fairness, resilience, and integrity. The protagonist felt a renewed connection to their home and community, grounded in the knowledge that standing up for oneself could lead to real, lasting change. Karen's presence became less of a concern as the neighborhood settled into a new normal. She maintained a low profile, and while she remained a part of the community, her influence and confidence in enforcing petty disputes diminished. The protagonist observed her caution with a sense of quiet reassurance, understanding that the combination of HOA authority and neighborhood awareness had shifted the balance. The community, once tense with the potential for conflict, now operated with more respect for rules and boundaries. The protagonist also reflected on the importance of preparation and evidence in resolving disputes. The careful documentation of the tractor damage, the coordination with neighbors, the consultations with legal and HOA resources had been key to achieving a fair outcome. These steps had not only resolved the immediate conflict, but also set a standard for handling similar situations in the future. The protagonist felt empowered, knowing that reasoned, methodical action could lead to justice and protection without resorting to hostility. As the weeks turned into months, the protagonists continued their weekend routines with the tractor, tending to the yard and enjoying the sense of accomplishment that came from hard work. The property, once the center of conflict, became a space of peace and pride. The tractor, fully restored and operational, symbolized not only practical utility, but also the strength of standing up for one's rights responsibly. The neighborhood, influenced by the visible resolution of the incident, experienced a subtle but meaningful shift. Residents felt more secure, knowing that aggressive or unreasonable behavior would be addressed through proper channels. Community interactions became more constructive, and the protagonist took pride in having contributed to that positive change. The experience, though stressful, had strengthened the sense of fairness and accountability in the area.